I never set out to create a zoo in my backyard, but it all started the day I rescued a pair of miniature goats from a roadside petting farm going out of business, and I figured my garden could use a bit of life. Before I even had time to build them a proper shelter, the HOA president, a woman named Carol whose only personality trait was knowing the community bylaws by heart, was already standing in my driveway holding a citation like she'd been lying in wait for exactly this moment. According to Carol, my goats violated no fewer than 6 separate regulations, including unauthorized livestock, disruption of the neighborhood aesthetic, and my personal favorite, a clause forbidding animals capable of producing non-domesticated noises. I argued that goats were practically pastoral ambience, but Carol had the dead-eyed stare of someone who once fined a man for using the wrong shade of beige for his garden gnome, and she was unmoved. That should have been the end of it. 2 goats, a slap on the wrist, maybe a $50 fine. But then my neighbor's kids spotted the goats and asked if they could have a birthday party in my garden to meet them, and somehow that innocent party snowballed into the most chaotic side hustle of my life. By the end of the week, parents were showing up with cash, asking if I could add a pony or maybe a few rabbits to the petting zoo, and I realized something dangerous. The HOA could fine me all they wanted, but the neighbors were loving this and they were willing to pay. With no permits, no plan, and no hesitation, I leaned all the way in, picking up a trio of rescue alpacas, a flock of exotic chickens, and, thanks to a Craigslist deal I didn't think would actually pan out, a retired circus llama with a crooked tooth and a bad attitude named Senor Spitsalot. I transformed my garden into a fully operational microzoo, complete with handmade signs, a donation box, and a tiny snack stand where kids could buy carrot bundles to feed the animals, all while Carol pounded my inbox with increasingly furious emails titled things like, "Immediate animal removal required," and "Final notice before legal escalation." What Carol didn't realize was that my backyard zoo had become a neighborhood sensation, with families showing up every evening for sunset alpaca walks and Sunday goat yoga on the lawn, and even my previously hostile neighbors were suddenly defending me at HOA meetings just so their kids could keep coming over to see the animals. Every time the HOA sent me a new violation, I added a new attraction. Carol complained about livestock noise, so I got a peacock that screamed like a car alarm every morning at sunrise. She cited me for improper fencing, so I painted a mural of cartoon animals all over the fence, and when they claimed my garden lacked appropriate landscaping, I planted a row of banana trees and told everyone I was opening a rainforest exhibit. By the time Carol realized the zoo wasn't a phase, it was a full-blown rebellion with community support. She called an emergency meeting to demand my immediate compliance. I showed up to the meeting late, still wearing my goat yoga instructor outfit, and calmly reminded the HOA that my property technically qualified as an urban farm under a loophole in our county zoning laws, which granted certain livestock exemptions if the animals were involved in educational or therapeutic activities. Goat yoga counted. School field trips counted. Carol's face turned the color of expired cottage cheese as I handed her a binder full of legal precedents and signed liability waivers from happy parents. But what truly broke her spirit was the petition, a full 200 signatures from local families demanding that the Maplewood Backyard Zoo be officially recognized as a community cultural asset, meaning any attempt to shut me down would require a 2/3 vote from homeowners. Carol, who had spent her life terrorizing this neighborhood over mailbox heights and lawn flamingos, suddenly found herself outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and, for the first time, deeply unpopular. She tried to rally her usual allies, but it turned out half of them had grandkids who loved my petting zoo, and the other half just enjoyed seeing Carol lose for once. In a final act of desperation, Carol called the county health department, claiming my garden was a breeding ground for disease, but when the inspector arrived, he left 30 minutes later with a belly full of llama-shaped cookies and a signed photo of Senor Spitsalot. By the end of that first month, my garden zoo had more 5-star Google reviews than the local community center, and families were booking visits months in advance. I was making more money off chicken feed and baby goat selfies than my actual job, and the HOA, once so powerful, had been reduced to sending passive-aggressive newsletters warning homeowners about unauthorized farm-themed gatherings. I stood in my garden one evening watching a toddler giggle uncontrollably as an alpaca tried to eat his shoelace, and realized something profound: I wasn't just running a zoo. I was running a revolution in real time, one goat at a time, and Carol and her clipboard army were powerless to stop me. The garden, once a boring patch of grass with HOA-approved azaleas, had become a kingdom, a sanctuary, and a giant middle finger to suburban tyranny, and every bleat, squawk, and peacock scream was music to my ears. But even as I basked in victory, I knew this was only the beginning, because Carol wasn't the type to go down quietly, and the war between Maplewood Zoo and Maplewood HOA was just getting started. Carol wasn't just angry, she was personally offended, as though my backyard zoo wasn't just a violation of bylaws, but a personal insult carved into her perfectly manicured lawn. Less than 24 hours after the emergency meeting where I legally outmaneuvered her, I woke up to a new HOA notice stapled directly to my garden gate, an act of aggression even bolder than her usual passive-aggressive letters, since official HOA communication was only supposed to arrive by mail or email. The notice wasn't even about the animals this time. It was a blanket list of violations that spanned everything from improper garden hose storage to unauthorized garden structures, all of which were transparently bogus. The kicker? Every violation came with a fine, and together they totaled over $15,000, a financial nuke disguised as paperwork. Carol, it seemed, had abandoned any pretense of diplomacy and gone straight for economic warfare, betting that if she buried me in fines, I would either fold or go bankrupt trying to fight back. What she didn't count on was how deeply the zoo had embedded itself into neighborhood life. Within hours of me posting the violation list on our neighborhood Facebook group, alongside a picture of Senor Spitzelot giving it a side eye, the comments exploded with outrage. Families who had celebrated birthdays in my garden, parents who had brought their kids for alpaca walks, even the notoriously cranky retiree down the street who never smiled. Suddenly everyone was furious at Carol for trying to shut down the only fun thing this neighborhood has ever had. The next day, a crowd of parents showed up at my door, offering cash donations to help cover the fines, but I had a better idea. A Save the Zoo fundraiser, complete with face painting, live music, and special behind-the-scenes tours where kids could help feed the animals. Carol tried to stop the event with a cease and desist, but I had already registered Maplewood Zoo LLC as a fully licensed educational nonprofit, which legally classified my fundraiser as a community outreach program exempt from HOA jurisdiction. The fundraiser raised $28,000, enough to pay the fines twice over, and the crowd cheered when I announced that every leftover dollar would go toward expanding the zoo with a new reptile habitat and a sanctuary pond for rescued ducks. Carol's fury was practically seismic, and the next morning she escalated from fines to outright sabotage. Someone, let's not pretend it was anyone but Carol, slashed my garden hose, dumped a mysterious powder into the animal feed bin, thankfully discovered before feeding time, and left a series of anonymous complaints to animal control about unsanitary conditions in my yard. When the inspector arrived, clipboard in hand and already exhausted from the obvious HOA-fueled wild goose chase, I greeted him with fresh lemonade, a fully documented animal care log, and a herd of animals so pampered they probably had better healthcare than I did. The inspector left with 0 violations and a selfie with Senor Spitzelot, who by now was a full-blown local celebrity with his own Instagram account run by my neighbor's teenager. But Carol wasn't finished. She staged an emergency community safety walkthrough, dragging half the HOA board to my backyard unannounced to look for violations in real time, hoping to catch me off guard. Instead, they walked into the middle of toddler safari hour, where a dozen giggling kids were riding around on my miniature donkeys while parents sipped wine and fed lettuce to the goats. Several board members, who had no real loyalty to Carol but feared her wrath, quietly slipped me thumbs-up gestures behind her back while she ranted about unapproved animal shelters and non-standard fencing materials. I calmly presented architectural drawings, all approved by a licensed contractor, showing my handmade barns were structurally sound, and thanks to a loophole Nancy the ex-CPA had uncovered, technically counted as art installations because of the murals painted on the side. Carol's face looked like she had swallowed a live scorpion, and by the time the walkthrough ended, her only victory was a citation for my allegedly excessively whimsical mailbox, which I proudly repainted into a zebra to match the zoo theme. Meanwhile, neighborhood parents organized a zoo lovers committee, essentially a pro-zoo shadow government that started attending HOA meetings and matching t-shirts, demanding updates on my behalf and loudly reading aloud every positive Yelp review the zoo received. Carol's grip on power slipped further every week, and the more she attacked me, the more she turned herself into a cartoon villain, the Cruella de Vil of suburban animal rights. By the time local news caught wind of the feud, the narrative was already out of her control. The media painted me as the quirky neighborhood zookeeper standing up to oppressive HOA tyranny, and Carol as the bitter busybody trying to crush children's dreams out of spite. I leaned into the role hard, granting interviews while holding a baby goat, casually mentioning that Carol once fined a veteran for hanging a slightly oversized flag, and making sure every camera angle featured wide-eyed kids cuddling animals in the background. My backyard zoo became a tourist attraction almost overnight, with visitors coming from neighboring towns just to take pictures at the now iconic Maplewood Micro Zoo, and every ticket sold made it harder for Carol to argue that I was a nuisance rather than a community treasure. My garden was no longer just a zoo, it was a symbol, a rallying point for everyone who had ever been victimized by petty suburban tyrants, and Carol's reign of terror was starting to crumble under the weight of her own pettiness. But as much as I was winning the battle, I knew Carol wasn't the type to surrender quietly, and if the past had taught me anything, it was that she still had a few dirty tricks left up her sleeve, waiting to be unleashed in one last desperate bid to kill the zoo once and for all. With every scheme Carol had thrown at me failing spectacularly, it was only a matter of time before she resorted to what every HOA tyrant sees as their ultimate weapon: a full-blown lawsuit aimed not just at me personally, but at the Maplewood Zoo itself. It was a classic scorched earth maneuver, accusing me of everything from operating an illegal commercial enterprise in a residential zone to creating a public nuisance, to damaging neighborhood property values through the presence of livestock, and even, absurdly, emotional distress caused by rooster crowing. The document was so bloated with exaggerated complaints and legal nonsense that my lawyer actually laughed out loud when he read it, but the threat was real. If Carol could drag me into court and bleed me dry with legal fees, she would finally win without ever proving a single real violation. What Carol did not expect was that the very same neighbors who once feared her clipboard and citations now saw me as their last line of defense, their folk hero standing between them and a lifetime of HOA tyranny. Within days of the lawsuit being announced, my front yard was covered in homemade signs reading "Save the Zoo, Free Senior Spitzelot," and "No Llama Left Behind," and a group of parents formed an unofficial zoo defense force, whose main purpose was to show up at every HOA meeting and courtroom appearance like a cheering section for a high school football team. They brought lawn chairs, snacks, and laminated photos of their kids feeding my goats, waving them like evidence every time Carol tried to argue that my zoo was ruining the community. Carol doubled down, hiring a law firm so predatory their website actually bragged about helping HOAs foreclose on homes for unpaid fines, but for every page of legal jargon they filed, my lawyer countered with pages of community testimonials, signed affidavits from local teachers about educational field trips, and even a statement from the county health inspector praising my animal care practices. The trial itself became a media circus, with reporters camping outside the courthouse interviewing parents, kids, and anyone who had ever stepped foot inside Maplewood Zoo. The longer the trial dragged on, the more Carol's case collapsed under its own ridiculous weight. The judge openly rolled his eyes when Carol claimed my peacock's calls were causing marital distress among homeowners, and he visibly smirked when Carol presented a blurry night vision photo of a goat she claimed had been illegally grazing 3 inches over my property line. By the second week of testimony, it was clear that Carol's lawsuit was not about law, safety, or property values. It was personal, a vendetta driven by her complete inability to handle being outmaneuvered. The final straw came when my lawyer played a secretly recorded video, sent anonymously by a sympathetic HOA board member, showing Carol ranting at a private meeting about how, "This zoo is a slap in the face to my authority and I will burn it to the ground if it is the last thing I do." The courtroom went silent except for the sound of Carol's own voice digging her legal grave, and from that moment forward, it was game over. The judge dismissed nearly every charge, ruling that the zoo was fully compliant under both county agricultural exemptions and educational use provisions, and he fined the HOA itself for abusing legal process for personal vendettas. But the real victory came after the ruling when my neighbors, flush with victory and high on righteous suburban rebellion, launched a formal petition to have Carol permanently removed as HOA president for unethical conduct, a petition that passed with more than 90% support. Carol's reign ended not with a bang, but with her sputtering resignation in the middle of a Zoom meeting, her Wi-Fi cutting out mid-tantrum as a toddler in the background shouted "Long live the zoo." As for me, I took the settlement money the HOA was ordered to pay for my legal fees and funneled every cent into expanding the zoo, installing new habitats, upgrading the fencing, and even adding a small amphitheater for educational shows, which quickly became a Saturday afternoon tradition. The zoo went from backyard curiosity to full-blown community institution, a living monument to the idea that one stubborn neighbor with a love for goats and a hatred for bureaucracy could take down an entire HOA regime. Carol moved out shortly after, unable to bear living in the shadow of her greatest defeat, and rumor has it she joined the board of an even stricter HOA in the next town over, where she could once again issue citations in peace. But her legacy lived on, immortalized in a new zoo attraction I unveiled at our annual Llama-Palooza festival, a scarecrow dressed in Carol's signature khaki outfit, clutching a clipboard, stationed permanently at the entrance under a sign that read "Beware the Wild Karen." The scarecrow became a selfie hotspot, a symbol of everything we had fought for, and every photo taken there was a quiet reminder that even the most overreaching HOA is no match for a community that chooses joy over rules, goats over bylaws, and llamas over fear. My garden, once just a patch of grass and Carol's personal battleground, was now a place where kids learned to care for animals, where neighbors gathered to laugh and celebrate, and where every crow, bleat, squawk, and bray echoed with freedom. The Maplewood Zoo had survived the war, but more importantly, it had rewritten the rules of suburban life itself, proving once and for all that the only thing stronger than an HOA is a neighborhood united by love, laughter, and one deeply stubborn man who refused to give up his goats. With Carol gone and the HOA defanged, my backyard zoo settled into a golden age where peace, prosperity, and llama yoga reigned supreme. What started as a messy rebellion against one woman's tyranny had evolved into something bigger than me, bigger than my garden, and even bigger than Maplewood itself. School field trips came in droves, local scout troops earned their animal care badges here, and people from neighboring towns made pilgrimages just to see the famous zoo that took down the HOA. Senor Spitsalot, once just an angry Craigslist llama, had become a full-blown mascot, appearing on t-shirts, bumper stickers, and even a limited edition batch of craft beer brewed in his honor by a local brewery called Freedom Farm Ale Works. The zoo became so popular I had to buy the empty lot next door just to expand the parking area, and what had once been a quiet suburban garden now had its own gift shop, snack stand, and fully booked weekend event calendar. But while the zoo flourished, I found myself increasingly nostalgic for the chaos that had created it, the sneaking around, the late-night legal research, the petty tricks and counter-tricks that made me feel like a suburban James Bond armed with nothing but loopholes and livestock. It turns out that defeating the HOA was not just fun, it had been my purpose, and with Carol gone and my kingdom secure, I felt a strange emptiness creeping in. That was when I received the email that changed everything, a formal invitation from a homeowners association 3 towns over, offering me a substantial sum to serve as a compliance consultant, which was essentially a fancy way of saying they wanted me to help them strengthen their rules to prevent another Maplewood Zoo situation. I nearly fell out of my chair laughing at the idea that the very system I had spent years fighting now wanted to hire me to help them tighten the screws, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized what a delicious opportunity it was. I accepted the job immediately, not to help them, but to quietly sabotage their bylaws from within, filling them with so many contradictory clauses, confusing exemptions, and self-defeating rules that no future homeowner could ever be fined for anything without also violating at least 3 other rules themselves. I became a double agent in the world of suburban governance, creating chaos with a smile while publicly advising neighborhoods on proactive compliance strategies, all while expanding the zoo into a non-profit foundation dedicated to teaching communities how to stand up to overzealous HOAs. The Maplewood Zoo Defense Fund became a legal aid network for anyone fighting unfair fines, bogus citations, or tyrannical board presidents across the state, and soon my phone was ringing off the hook with calls from desperate homeowners asking how to outsmart their own Carols. My garden had become more than a zoo, it had become a headquarters for the resistance, a living museum of loophole warfare where every animal enclosure had a story, every mural hid a piece of legal strategy, and every visitor left not just with a smile, but with a copy of my self-published guide, Guerrilla Gardening Against HOAs. Carol herself became something of a suburban legend, her name invoked like a cautionary tale at neighborhood potlucks and block parties, a bogeyman whose defeat gave hope to anyone with a dream too big for a lawn covered in uniformly approved mulch. There were even rumors she tried to start her own anti-zoo blog, but it was hard to build a following when your greatest achievement was losing to a man who owned a peacock that could scream in perfect C-sharp. Meanwhile, the zoo evolved into something even I had not expected, a full community hub where animals were only part of the draw. We hosted outdoor movie nights, goat-themed holiday parades, and even a summer concert series where local bands played while alpacas wandered through the crowd. What was once my backyard had become the beating heart of the neighborhood, and even though I never set out to become the accidental mayor of Maplewood, it turned out I was pretty good at it. I eventually retired from my day job entirely, devoting myself full-time to the zoo and its growing network of suburban freedom fighters, but I always kept Carol's first violation notice framed in my office, a reminder of how it all began. Every time I saw it, I felt a mix of nostalgia, pride, and just a little bit of spite, knowing that her attempt to crush me had instead made me untouchable. I often stood at the garden fence in the evenings, watching families walk by and wave at the animals, remembering how this all started with 2 goats and a stubborn refusal to back down. My garden, once just a patch of grass that barely qualified as landscaping, was now a fortress of joy, a testament to the power of community, creativity, and a healthy dose of rebellion. The Maplewood Zoo wasn't just a place, It was proof that even in the most regulated, over-policed suburbs, ordinary people could take back control, and all it took was one determined neighbor with a love for animals and a willingness to break every rule in the book. I had beaten the HOA, built a legacy, and become a hero to neighborhoods everywhere, but the greatest victory of all was knowing that somewhere out there, in some other cookie-cutter neighborhood, another Carol was sweating through her khakis, terrified that her residents had just heard about the Maplewood Zoo and were starting to wonder if they could build one too.